Welcome back, everybody, to the Powerlifters Programming Podcast. After a little hiatus, we got Joe Stanek back on today. Got a lot of topics to go over, so let's get right into it. I think probably like the biggest topic is what you're doing with Perk's training. I heard he's doing something very interesting now. You want to tell the people what it is and why you're doing that?
Sure. So first of all, I think first repeat guest, right? Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. All right. Love taking that title.
You had to pay me $500 to come back on, but
they don't need to know that. No, but yeah, thanks for having me back on. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I do feel like we kind of left the conversation on the last podcast with this particular topic. Like afterward, we were talking about, what is Perk gonna do in preparation for him having his baby. So we came up with this idea. Like we really talked through a lot of the things that tend to bottleneck people's training when they have like a big life event like this. And in particular for him, obviously it's sleep and time. Those are the two big things that are going to change the most, right? So my thought was this period of time can't be something where we're really pushing hard to try to get better. What we need to do is do our best to minimize the damage from the first, say, 4 to 6 weeks so that we can actually jump into things. And luckily, Perk's wife is also super supportive. So that helps out too. So we came up with this idea of trying to train at a very high frequency. And when I say high frequency, I mean doing something very similar to what Agatha does, just very, very high frequency SBD. Now, in Perk's case, I think the system that I've kind of come up with is a little bit different, but the general goal is to try to be able to match or maybe slightly undershoot the tonnage that he typically gets. Now, why is tonnage important in this case? The general idea here is I want to keep his ability to do the work that gets him stronger similar, but I also don't want him to be pushing so hard that it's just impossible for him to do well. The parameters that we kind of came up with too, he told me, I'm not going to have 1 million hours to train during this time because I gotta be with Sid and the baby. So we basically came up with a system where he's going to go a little bit more often because he can steal, an hour plus the 15-minute drive to drive to the gym. He can steal that away. That's totally fine. And, obviously Sid has given the thumbs up on that as well. So we're designing this training in a way where we're increasing the frequency to 6 days per week. And he's doing all 3 lifts every single day. But the set counts are going to be very, very low. The actual intensity is going to be very, very low. But the whole goal is to kind of, match, maybe slightly undershoot the typical tonnages that he experiences over the course of an actual training block. So that's kind of what we're shooting for in general. The way that I've done this, and again, this is kind of, I guess the right term would be bastardizing Powell's system that he uses with Agatha. From what I understand, a lot of it has to do with 2 major concepts: polarization, and then just the idea of what the typical microcycle looks like. So polarization, from what I understand it, the way that Powell has explained it on other podcasts and talking with him after Sheffield, is kind of just making the sessions very, very different from session to session, typical undulation. But the thought is also, how do those sessions kind of prime each other, right? So making sure that those sessions kind of have very different stimuli from session to session. And then applying that concept to Perk's usual microcycle, right? So if we'll just use his squat, because we talked about that a lot on the last podcast, with his particular cycle, we're still going to run through that usual 3-day per week microcycle, but the sessions in between are going to be polarized sessions that are just basically keeping him trained throughout. So the whole idea is he gets a lot more exposure to the movement pattern, which will keep his competency up. And again, it'll allow us to kind of fill some of the gaps with those tonnages. But the general sessions are still going to look the same. His tertiary session is still going to be that sort of, first session of the week. It'll still be pause squats, but he'll probably only do like 1 set. And then the session after that, it'll be really, really light, just percentages that I generally assign him. Like I'll give him some room to adjust, of course, because let's face it, you can never predict with how little he might be sleeping. But, it might be, some doubles with like 50%, like nothing crazy, just literally just going in, getting under the bar, doing the movement pattern. That's really all it is. And then he'll go into his ascending set session. But again, we probably won't do the full, ascending set workout. We'll probably keep things, a little bit lighter, generally keeping things pretty unintense as far as things go. Again, a polarized session because he tends to do a little bit better with those moderate reps. So we'll generally kind of save those for the main day. So maybe the next day is 50% again, but he's doing, sets of 7, something like that, just like one set of 7. And then he'll come in and do his main day, do that like usual. But he'll probably only take his top set and 1 back down. And then, the last session, again, we'll probably do just some very light repetitions, just getting things in. And the whole goal, and obviously I have to have the exact calculations in front of me to give you the exact figures here, but just basically want that tonnage number to be the same. We want the intensity to be down and the frequency to be up.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. I've noticed Agata, she definitely has a lot of that polarization, and she also uses, I guess, polarization with variations. So I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but the stimulus is very different each day. So I'm trying to say, sometimes she's doing like slingshot bench, sometimes she's doing like double pause deadlifts. Is that something you're going to be doing with Perk, more squat bench deadlift variation?
So I have talked to him about this, and right now we're kind of in this interim period between when we're doing this concept and when we're applying it. I think what I'm probably going to do to kind of help simulate some of the greater intensity without it being difficult for him to get through is I'll probably do something like that with just why can't I think of the word? Isometric contractions, so pause work and tempo work as well. Because the other thing too that I'm worried about here is his soft tissue's ability to recover, right? Because obviously we are increasing frequency, so that could be a problem, right? But I think if we actively use that training as a way to also better his tendons, this will help him in the end. So what we'll probably be doing with some of those lower rep variations on the polarized days will more than likely just do some work with some pause squats and some tempo squats, just to again make sure that he's not doing anything that is so crazy in terms of the loading, but also just kind of gives him a little bit more of that sort of polarized effect.
Okay, so he's not getting back into his old squat suit and knee wraps.
No, you could not pay me to have him do that. Well,
yeah, understandable.
Maybe.
Yeah, just the right amount of money. So it kind of makes sense. I mean, it's a natural progression on like bench. That's not too uncommon, bench 6 days a week, especially with him already doing a higher frequency. Squat makes sense too. But how do you approach this kind of thing going from a 2 times a week deadlift frequency to just jumping into the 6? Like, are you still going to have one day that's fairly heavy and just everything else is super light? Or is it just in general going to be fairly light work?
Yeah. So what I'm doing there, because that is probably the most concerning of the 3, right? You never see somebody. I mean, you are seeing more people doing 3 times a week deadlifting now if they're like a sumo puller, right? Like I'm seeing that more commonly, thanks to I think Sean Noriega. But I do think in his case, what we're gonna do. So his typical microcycle, just for anybody that didn't listen to the last episode, is 1 day of conventional that's ascending and usually beltless and sumo. So what we're probably going to do is just make the rest of the day singles, literally nothing else. That way we can back off on the sets on the main day and then just keep things relatively similar on the primary day. And the way that I'm probably going to do it is just utilize it in, sorry, let me check my notes just to make sure I'm saying this right. We're basically going to place the sumo work towards the end of the week, just and again we'll polarize the variations where he's doing like some pause work, stuff like that. Sumo work towards the end of the week where his primary is, just so that movement pattern feels good, and then the conventional stuff will be towards the beginning of the week, because that's also, if you think about it, where the workload is the beginning of the week with his tertiary squats, that's kind of the easier side of things on the squat side. So if we can kind of push the what would be the more fatiguing of the 2 variations, conventional, I think that'll work. We've also realized, I was literally talking about this with him, I think day before yesterday. We've also realized that conventional is just really good for powering his sumo, which, I think that's a lot of people. But we were talking about why that is, and I really do think that in his case, he's just such a good squatter that basically eliminating the adductors towards the beginning of the week when he's doing all of that squat work, I think that helps him express strength better on his sumo deadlifts. So it's basically just going to be first half of the week is conventional, second half of the week is sumo, and we're going to polarize the variations that he works up to basically just be, easier on certain days, harder on the others, depending on how his recovery looks. And I do acknowledge that I'm probably going to have to be relatively dynamic on what I have him do, just kind of based on how he's sleeping and how he's reacting to these things. There's going to have to be a very, very high level of communication, which luckily Perk is pretty good at telling me, like, hey, dude, I feel like dog shit right now, So, yeah, that's kind of the general idea. I do think that just singles, and then the main days, it's usually 3 ascending sets on his secondary day, and then top set, and then 2 back downs on his main day. So it'll probably just be like, 1 main rep set of conventional, like no ascending work there, and then top set and 1 back down on his main day, and that's it.
Yeah, and only having 1 rest day a week. How are you gonna have that play into things? Like on a certain lift, maybe like bench, is it going to be the rest day is going to be not right before the primary day? You want to be kind of primed for that, versus maybe a deadlift. The rest day is the day before the primary. Trying to go heavy, or how are you periodizing that?
So what I'm generally going to do is I'm going to keep his singular rest day just that day, like just he does nothing on that day, because let's face it, I think with all of that work, it's probably better. And then that way I can always assume too that the beginning of the week, the actual Monday, even though technically speaking, again, we talked about this on the last podcast, his weeks are kind of offset, where they start with his bench and deadlift and then end with his squat. But that actual like beginning of the true week on Monday, I'm going to kind of always expect to be a little bit off as a result of that, because of the lower frequency. Perk, just being a smaller lifter, having the leverages that he does, he just does better when he does things back to back. And I'm actually also using this time to sort of test, speaking of the bench press, to kind of test out what we need to change in order to get his bench really going. Because obviously, he did great at Worlds. Spoiler alert, he won best lifter, taking 5 lifts. He did good, but we've had this initial burst of progress on bench when we first started working together. And then last year, right around the time of Bench Worlds, he benched 210 a bunch, and then it's kind of been downward ever since, right? Well, maybe not downward, but just stagnant. And admittedly, part of that is because for Worlds prep, we did knock a bench day down, and that was purely because he needed more time with his wife. But we agreed after how Worlds went that he needs that extra bench day. But I'm thinking to myself, where should that extra bench day go? So this 6 days a week thing is going to help me test that out. If it goes well, I'm probably going to have him bench 5 days in a row. But if he doesn't do so great, then we're probably going to make it so that workload is still front loaded, sort of 3 days a week, day off, 2 days, that kind of deal. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, the way that I have the bench laid out is very interesting too, currently, because I'm still playing around with it. But we're actually doing what I would call a double microcycle setup. I don't know if you've ever heard of something like that before.
Kind of like you repeat 3 days later in the week.
Yep. So it's literally 3 days and you end the microcycle and then you start it all over again.
That's exactly how my training is set up right now. Funny enough.
Oh, there you go. Great minds think alike, huh?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm testing that out just to kind of see how that goes. But one thing that we've realized, and this is like what he's kind of doing is sort of his maintenance work right now, is that he always seems to just bench really well back to back. Like he's currently only benching 4 days a week still, but it's literally just the same 2 days with a day of rest in between. And then because currently he's taken 2 days off in between his bench days, again just for purposes of helping with his wife and things like that, we always assume that the first microcycle is going to be the worst. And again, in general, I'm expecting for this 6 day a week approach, I'm going to expect that first microcycle is going to be a little worse because he'll be taking that day off in between.
This is going to be like the coolest experiment to see, especially because you're just kind of like jumping to this from circumstance instead of like we like slowly kind of move towards that, how like you would with the bench frequency. Going to be super interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah. I mean, there is a part of me that's a little worried about it, but I think that it's the best way. If you're only doing 1 or 2 sets a day and you're really limited on time, and let's be honest, your recovery is probably not going to be the greatest. I think, like when you think about the reason that this works well for Agatha, powerlifting is just a very very specific version of bodybuilding when you think about it, right? Like bodybuilders are very generally strong, right? Like it's one of the reasons why you can take a bodybuilder who is relatively untrained in terms of the actual neurological movement pattern type stuff on squat, bench press, and deadlift and tell them to max out, and they're still going to be pretty strong, right? But that's also why powerlifters who actually train it regularly are stronger, right? So my theory on this is that if our sort of specific thing that we care about the most is maintaining competency with the squat, bench press, and deadlift, while also acknowledging the fact that we're not going to be able to recover as well, this is the best solution. Just being able to do it very, very often, making sure that that stays that way, rather than kind of going the opposite route and just trying to train really, really hard 1 day a week. It's just not going to work,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that totally makes sense, especially if he's just working up to a single on a deadlift. I mean, you can do that so quick. If you've squatted before, you're already pretty warm, and Perk's a pretty explosive, athletic type of lifter too. So I imagine he'll be able to acclimate to that pretty quick.
Yep, definitely.
And then let's jump into Gustav a little bit. So
sure.
I think you had about 16 weeks to work with him. Is that correct? There's that.
It was 14, but
okay, 14 weeks. So with the turnaround that quick going into another meet, I'm assuming, like we talked about this a little bit after the podcast last time, you can't just completely overhaul everything.
Right.
You need it to be predictable. But now you guys got a little bit of a longer off season after the World Games. So are you going to be trying to change his programming quite a bit, overhaul it to look more like a structure that you'd like to see? Or are you just going to keep building off all of his training data?
Right. So first, I think we should probably talk about the worlds of it all, right? Because obviously he lost. Now, I'm going to try to not be disrespectful to the judges here. I don't think that his third squat was a bad lift. I don't know. After talking to him afterwards, because for those that may for some reason have not seen the 93 kilo session, he got all 3 violations for why his lift was bad, which made it impossible for us to challenge that. And I do believe that if we had gotten that squat, we would have won.
Oh, I agree.
That was the thing that killed us, unfortunately. And hindsight could be 2020. Maybe we should have taken 2.5 less just to make sure, but it is what it is. He definitely showed up strong on the day. And we were a little bit more cautious with his bench press because we wanted to make sure that he got kilos. I think he probably had another 2.5 left in him. No issue there. And then obviously deadlift, we kind of had to pull for the win. So there's a couple of things that I think are important to acknowledge before we talk about programming changes. The first is that there was a little bit of a difference in his body weight this go around. So upon kind of talking post meet with Kedrick, who does his nutrition, we kind of talked about this. He sat a little bit heavier at Sheffield. And I do think that that's probably partially responsible for why performance wasn't perfect on the day. He made weight a little bit easier, but I think the body weight that he started his cut from was just higher. Now, mind you, with Sheffield, with the way that things work there, and this is some really like meta game time shit that you got to think about. By the time you're hitting the platform on, say, a Sheffield versus IPF Worlds, you're gonna have a lot more extra time, right? Because there's sort of the ceremony of it all. The fact that lifters, have to finish warming up and then like go up the elevator to get on stage, there's a bunch of extra time that isn't there with a world level competition. And because of that, I think, Gustav was able to take advantage of that and just naturally felt way better because he sat heavier, cut a little bit more, and then was able to refuel and just be heavier under the barbell. So we've talked about that. And again, without even making any program changes and decisions, we've kind of agreed that that's sort of the move in the future, is just to sit a little bit heavier. Maybe for Worlds, maybe not quite as heavy as you would for a Sheffield, but a bit heavier than what he was. So that's going to be important too, because I think that being able to be heavier under the bar and knowing that given enough time, you can cut and be, back to a reasonable weight. The other thing too, and this is something that I don't know, I've not seen, and I don't want to insult Kedrick on this because he is like the guy when it comes to making weight. But one thing in my personal philosophy of things, like I did this for Perk when I did his weight cut, and I think Worlds went really well because of that. I pay really close attention to where my athlete's body weight is throughout the competition. It's not just, oh, I've made weight and rehydrated. It's how is your body weight changing? How much you go into the bathroom, things like that. I do think in Gustav's case, especially because that venue was like a sauna, it was so hot and everybody was sweating like crazy. I do think that that's something that we have to pay a little bit closer attention to in further competitions, because I think that that probably had something to do with his energy levels too. So all that is to say is that these changes are with those things acknowledged, right? That we know that there's some other factors that came into play there. So the first thing that I'll say is we kind of agreed that in general, the idea of really tapering him into comp like he's always done probably is not going to work as well as previous. And the simple reason is that he's just much stronger, right? If you pull back in that same way, it's not going to have the same effect, right? You're probably going to detrain. The other thing too that we agreed upon was just a pretty basic principle that I think most people know these days. We need to be strong on the right day consistently. You need to be used to that. And bench press, which I think is, that was the only thing that was truly my approach this go around. Bench press was aligned with the day that he competed. So it worked out really well in that case. So we've decided that the model that we're going to go with is something where we're actually doing a primary SBD day. And that's very different for him, something that's very, very, very different. But I do think that that model is going to be best for him because he's just so strong in general, especially when, everything lines up in the microcycle, right? So what I'm planning on doing with him from here on, like we're testing it out for the World Games. So he's starting his training week on Friday because that's the first day of the World Games. Like I said to you off camera, that for some reason the heavyweight men are the first session. I don't know why that is, but they are. So his week starts on Friday with primary SBD, and then we do his secondaries in varying ways afterward. Now, as far as the changes to his setup, we've generally acknowledged the fact that he tends to just do well on relatively low reps. And I do think this is the fact that he's probably the tallest 93 competitor out of the ones that are very, very competitive. He's just got such a long range of motion in general. So we're kind of milking that right now. We're just making sure that for the most part, he has like one higher rep bench day. But for the most part, most of his stuff is very low repetition, and it's also relatively high intensity, because that is the one thing that I can take from his previous training that seems to work well. So a lot of his secondaries, they start heavy and they only advance by about half an RP in terms of the intensity cap. And I don't know, I've noticed that when I work with, and we can, if we get to Keenan, we can talk about this too. When I work with taller lifters that have very long ranges of motion, that tends to be a trait of the secondary that needs to be the case. The secondary needs to be a certain level of difficult, and you actually have to start relatively intense, because if you don't, if you start too light, then that session just doesn't provide enough of a training stimulus that you are able to actually consistently feel strong. So that's kind of the general setup. His bench cycle, we've consistently been doing 4 days per week. We moved up to 4 days a week for his comp cycle, and that obviously worked really well. So we're going to keep doing 4 days a week. The interesting thing about that is, compared to his squat and deadlift, he has more work that's lower intensity, but he just has a lot more exposure to heavier intensity, and that's working pretty well. So that's the general overview, and I think we're going to continue to. We're going to see how the World Games goes, right? Because like I said to you off camera, he's got a lot of life stuff going on. He's personally, like, it's him and his fiance renovating his new place. Like they have sledgehammers, they're tearing things down, they're working, several hours a day, very physical labor. And then he also has his brother's wedding the weekend before the World Games. So I'm not saying that it's going to be a perfect prep. We didn't expect it to be, especially with the turnaround from Worlds. But if we can come in and feel pretty strong on the day and hopefully total, somewhere around where we would have if we hadn't missed that squat, I think it'll be good proof of concept.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that adds another question I wasn't even thinking of before. But whenever an athlete has a quick turnaround into another comp, what do you think are like mistakes people make a lot? Because that's a tough thing to do. If you only have one or two blocks, it's easy to be like, oh, turnaround was so quick, couldn't gain momentum, was fatigued for a while, detrained, whatever the case is. What are ways to make that go smoother?
Sure. It doesn't happen super often, if I'm honest, but I think that the first thing that people definitely make a mistake on is they try to sandwich too much into a small prep. We're assuming in general that because you have a quick turnaround, you are going to be relatively adapted to heavy weights, right? Like, yes, you've gone through a peak. You're probably not at your best when you're starting that block, but you should be going in with the assumption that you have just done a lot of work with heavyweight, right? So the thought is for a lot of people, the mistake that I see happen is that they try to switch that up and they do, some kind of like volume block or something like that, or they just up the reps just for the sake of, making it a little bit different from what they did. I can understand maybe, trying to minimize fatigue or whatever, but I just think that's a mistake. You already have the adaptions. So what you do is you just treat it like a block of singles, right? You just competed. Maybe you did a little bit of a taper, but if you've set up your training in a smart way, you should be able to just jump right back in, right? So the idea is, in general, knowing your block structures that work well, and then depending on how much time you have in between, trying to fit in those blocks with heavier exposures. Now, if you've got like 12 weeks and your typical block length is 4, you can maybe get away with one block that is generally a little bit different, maybe just to give them some kind of like reprieve. But I think that getting too far away from what you've just done is a mistake. And I think that a lot of people will kill back-to-back preps if they do that. Keenan is a great example. We did this back in, I can't remember what year it was, but we didn't even have time to do a second prep. He competed 3 weeks apart. He had a meet in Hong Kong that he did, and then he came in and did, what did he do? He had I think it was the USAPL Korea meet where he beat Russ. Yeah, that's what it was. So at the time, that was the all-time world record for 110s as well, which was pretty cool. So he competed in Hong Kong, and then we just literally went back to back. And the reason that worked is because we just treated it like it was just a block of singles. Like, he did all of his back downs after the competition, and we just kept training. So the point is that you have to look at it like you haven't actually competed. Like and if you're smart about the way that you train, that's generally how competition blocks should look anyway, right? Like, you whether you're competing or not, you look at that last block like you're competing. It should always be that way.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I remember Chance Mitchell, he used to say, I think he would go to Pit Shark after like each competition or something. He's like, man, I'm not taking this week off. I'm not even taking a day off. I'll go to my accessories I was supposed to do anyway. So yeah, I bet that makes a huge difference, just so you don't lose all that momentum that you're building block to block. But speaking of Keenan, he's an athlete that really does not post his training nearly as much as Perk and Gustav. Right. I mean, you can look at Perk and Gustav's training, kind of have a good idea of what it looks like, the setup. But could you talk a little bit about just what Keenan's training looks like, because he doesn't post it, and then maybe he is so strong in a heavier weight class, so jacked, just kind of how that plays a role?
Yeah. So, I mean, Keenan, so I have known and coached Keenan since 2019, which a lot of people don't really know. Now, mind you, there have been some periods of time where I haven't been his coach for varying reasons, just him not being in love with powerlifting as much, things like that. But in general, I've known the guy for a really long time. So first of all, Keenan, unfortunately, is very injury prone. If you ever see him in person, he's super jacked, and then he's got joints that looks like he's made of glass. And Keenan, if you're listening to this, love you to death, man. You know it's true. So in his case, we have to build training in a way that allows him to stay as healthy as possible, but also take really heavy weights, which those two things kind of are a little bit conflicting. And of all of the lifters that I've worked with, I do think that he's probably the person who I've seen the most success with varying strategies compared to, you know, like Austin, who I've just kind of had this really golden approach that we've milked for such a long time. And so I can say pretty wholeheartedly that right now we're kind of still in this discovery phase, because we have a lot of data from over the years where it's worked and then it hasn't, right? So right now, in getting ready for Sheffield, we actually just had a call yesterday. He's finishing up his honeymoon, which apparently became like the meme of IPF Worlds. Everybody was telling him to have fun on his honeymoon. I can confirm that they did. I don't know if you saw, he squatted like 700 pounds in a hotel gym, which has got to be some kind of record.
Oh yeah.
So we got off the phone and he was like, yeah, I'm gonna train today just to make sure that when I get back to Korea, you know, everything doesn't feel like crazy heavy. I didn't think he meant squat 700 pounds. Anyway, so with his training specifically, he's another lifter who his primary, we have consistently done all 3 primaries on the same day. And I think that works very well when you're dealing with somebody who's a super outlier that lifts very heavy weight, because it just kind of allows you to tailor the rest of the week to help with recovery. Let's face it, when the absolute bar load is high, recovery, I think, plays a little bit more of a factor in the way that you have to set up the microcycle, particularly if you're dealing with someone like Keenan, who has had a history of various injuries, adductor multiple times, pec multiple times, elbows, like all kinds of things. So that's kind of the way that we've done it traditionally. For this prep in particular, it was kind of a trial by fire, right? We had exactly 4 weeks to train when we got the call up to Worlds. So we were already kind of experimenting with his microcycle then, and we just said, you know what, we're going to ride the wave. So to clue everybody in, at the meet, at PLA Nats, he hurt his adductor on his second attempt, and then he made it worse going out trying to do his third. So because of that, we were really concerned that we were just going to need like a long time. And then he got really sick after his wedding, which luckily I was, in Korea for. And he just had to take like a whole week off of doing nothing. And then he woke up, I think 5 days after being sick, and was just like, wow, I'm healed. And his adductor was fine. So we had already started doing a block that was very conventional heavy. He's always been, and I think my theory behind this with his particular stance, because it's kind of like a hybrid sumo type thing, the torso angle is very similar between conventional and his sumo deadlift. So I think that there's just a natural level of transfer. So we had agreed that really pushing the conventional would be something that would be good to start the off season with. And we were already so deep into it, we're just like, you know what, we're just going to pull conventional the entire prep. And that's what we did. So we literally like just pulled all conventional stuff. And I start with that because that was very unconventional of me. But we were just worried about him not being able to squat in a healthy way. We were really worried about re-aggravating that adductor, especially with this huge uptick in tonnage. So in his case, what we decided to do was we actually had the primary SBD day, which was on the Saturday, because again, that's when he competes. And then he benches 3 to 4 times a week, depending on where we are in prep. The Monday session is moderate reps, and we actually do an AMRAP on that day, which I'm happy to explain a little bit later. Then middle of the week is secondary work on all 3 lifts. So just, again, kind of 2 days in between that, I guess that's a Wednesday. Yeah. So Thursday, Friday off from the secondary going into the primary. And then he has his priming bench session on Thursdays. So that's kind of the general setup. Now throughout prep, again, it was just very all over the place. And we kind of, and admittedly at Keenan's suggestion, which again, I think you got to listen to your lifters, we kind of made a little bit of a game time decision, and we moved where his secondaries were happening to earlier in the week, because like I said, the recovery side of it wasn't good. His movement patterns were really primed, but he was coming into his primary day feeling very fatigued. So we actually moved it to earlier in the week, and then we added a priming session. So basically he would just work up to just, well, 300 kilos is not a light single, but it's light for him. So he would just literally just work up to a single on bench press, which ironically kind of primes the primer day. Work up to a single on conventional deadlift. And ultimately we found that was what was working. So that's going to be our new approach in general. So we're going to have a little bit more rest. He's going to start off his actual week, the Mondays, with the secondary day. We're going to have that priming day be on the Thursday, and then we'll continue to milk the primary day on the Saturday. And I think the reason that works so well ultimately, just to kind of answer the question and acknowledge how do you deal with somebody who is lifting such heavy weight, you have to be able to do just unorthodox things when it comes to working with an outlier like that. And that's not something that I would recommend like your average individual power lifter to do something like, because it doesn't make sense on paper. But in Keenan's case, it maximizes recoverability while also making him feel strong on the right days.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common that as you get stronger, one lift kind of bleeds into the other, or even just as you get bigger, maybe your elbows get more beat up on a low bar. So you have to be careful of what days you're squatting low bar and what days you're benching heavy, that kind of thing. I know like Jesus, obviously, someone like that is at the very extreme of just being massive and insanely strong. He talks about that a lot in his YouTube videos.
Yeah.
I just had one more question about Keenan then. Do you want to touch more on that AMRAP, why you do the AMRAP, what you look for?
Yeah. So again, admittedly, this is from a period of time. Many people might not know this. Many people might. But Keenan, while we were working together, he got a hernia, which if you know anything about Austin, that also happened. So apparently I'm bad luck. But during that period of time that he was rehabbing from it, unlike with Perk, the lower body stuff didn't come back very quickly for him. So he just decided, I'm just going to focus on bench press. And he wanted to come up with a way to sort of simulate a level of intensity that allowed him to kind of feel what it's like to move heavy weight without the weight itself being heavy. And so what he settled on was just on what would be his tertiary bench day, which is at the beginning of the week, he'd be doing high to moderate reps depending on where he was. And mind you, like since I've come back in, we've settled on the fact that we need that day to stay moderate, because if it's too light, it's just too light. But all those are still relatively easy sets for him, like somewhere in the range of 75 to 80% for maybe 3 or 4, all really manageable, not easy but not difficult either. And then that last set is just kind of there to sort of stimulate him in a way that's very similar to moving a heavy bench. I'm usually not a huge fan of AMRAPs for men. I do utilize them a lot when I'm working with women, just because it kind of like, as you know, with girls, they can really just hammer out the volume. So it kind of gives you a little top off of volume.
Mm-hmm.
You're hitting exactly that amount that you need on that day. But yeah, in Keenan's case, the purpose is a little bit different. It's just to kind of get in a couple of reps that stimulates him in a way that's similar to those heavier benches without it being something that's impossible for him to recover from.
Yeah, funny enough, in my training, I literally train like a bodybuilder with the power lifts solely because it's fun. Like I do not program for anyone like this that I coach, but I literally just do squat, bench, deadlift, AMRAPs every week. I do 0 sub max sets, literally just all AMRAPs because it's fun. And I obviously train in periods as well where it's more typical powerlifting approach. But This is just super fun way for me to train for some reason. But
is it APRE?
APRE?
Auto-regulated progressive resistance exercise. Have you never heard of that concept before?
APRE. I've probably heard of the concept, not that term though.
So it's basically using AMRAPs to auto-regulate your approach. So
exactly.
Okay, yeah. So that was before RPE was popularized. That was the popular method of auto-regulation. Was doing AMRAPs on, I think it was every other week. There's a whole paper on it. I forget whose study it is, but yeah, people just basically did AMRAPs every other week, and depending on the number of reps that they got versus the percentage of their 1RM that they were doing, they would add 5-10 pounds to the bar load the next week.
No, yeah, it's basically like that. It's like a 3-day split. Basically, think like push pull legs essentially, and I'll just do an AMRAP each time, repeat. It's literally just like a bodybuilding program, but you just swap out like incline dumbbell for just like bench press, but
We
make
we
it fun.
we talked about it before. Like powerlifting is in a lot of ways like a very hyper specific bodybuilding approach. Bodybuilders are like their whole goal is to get very strong at a variety of movements, because by getting strong at that high variety of movements, they get bigger. Right.
Mhm.
So we're kind of doing the same thing, but we also have to prioritize performance on certain weeks, which is why we aren't just going balls to the wall all the time. Although
Yeah.
it seems like that works well for you. So
Yeah, it's really just for fun. I have some people ask me, they'll like come to me and like, oh, you training this way? Are you gonna train me that way? I'm like, if you like want, but I would really prefer not to, especially
right.
because like at first when you're doing it, you can have some crazy training fluctuations, and if you're not very emotionally mature, you're gonna hate training. You go like do an AMRAP twice a week on squat, and you don't just add a rep each time, and that's not realistic. If you see a little backsliding the first couple weeks while you're dialing in the system because it's so different from what you're doing, you're going to be really upset with yourself. But when the going's good, it's great, and you get a lot of good data. It simplifies it. You don't have to like worry about priming and stuff like that too much because you're kind of going all out every time. But probably not the best for injury's sake either.
probably. But you know what? For some people, it just works, right?
Yeah, it's fun.
That's the summary of what powerlifting training is. Like,
Yeah.
For some people, it just works.
Yeah. I have so much fun doing it too that I'm like, I can't change it up. If I can make it work, I'm not going to change it until it does not work.
I mean, I train every day. That's fun for me. It energizes me. It can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but legitimately, like I love a good like hour-long workout where I work super hard, and then I have the rest of my day to do what I need to do. And yes, that means I train 7 days a week, but I sleep well, I eat well. More importantly, I'm able to manage my stress with everything else that I have to worry about because I'm not in the gym for a million hours. It works.
Yeah, exactly. I know you do have a time crunch, so last question. I am curious because not a lot of coaches coach such incredibly high-level athletes at the same time, Gustav, Perk, and Keenan. So my question is, do you notice any similarities in it can be their training, how they respond to training, even just mindset, anything like that? Beyond just like, you give them training, they just get strong because they got good genetics.
Oh, geez. I think I'll touch on the mentality side of things first because I think that's important. They have a resilience to them, right? And I think this is the case with any really high performing athlete, right? Something could go astronomically wrong, and they might be mad or sad. Like obviously, Gustav just lost Worlds. That sucks.
Mhm.
But literally, like. Afterward, he was like, yeah, he was a little disappointed, but afterward, he's like, okay, how do we get better? And that's, I think, something that you can't measure, right? You can only observe it. But if there's one thing, I've been very lucky to work with a lot of great lifters over the years. And if there's one thing that they all have, it's just there's such a level of resilience. They are always just there to work. They don't get down in the dumps if something goes wrong for a long period of time. Don't get me wrong, they don't ignore the feel. Like Perk especially, he's a little bit of an emotional guy for sure. But he's sad for 5 minutes if something goes wrong, and then he's like, all right, we get better.
Mhm.
So that's the mentality side of things is definitely the case. I think Keenan's probably one of the best examples of anybody that I've seen because he's been in the game for such a long time. He started really high. Like he placed podium at USAPL Nats from the regular session for 105s. So he started, and that was his first nationals ever, third powerlifting meet. So he started off on a pretty high level, and it's just been kind of all over the place as he's gone through his career. He's had all these injuries constantly that he could definitely say, I'm getting too old for this shit. I'm getting hurt. I could stop. But he doesn't stop because he has a singular goal to be the best in the world. So I think that alone is probably important. And what's funny is I think that what you just said about just giving someone training and them getting strong, I think that it is kind of the opposite for elite lifters. And I don't mean this in a way where like if they were elite when they first started that they couldn't just get strong. But I do think that elite lifters, they tend to need a little bit more specific work in order to actually get them strong. And they might get stronger, but in order to get them optimally strong, they need more customization. They need more things that are specific to them only, right? All the questions that we just went through, of all the things that I just talked about, all of those things are probably not things that, say, somebody with 100 GL points or like a 450 dot score. If that kind of a lifter came to me, those are not things that I would probably end up giving to those individuals, right? But in Austin's case, in Gustav's case, in Keenan's case, we're trying to literally push the bounds of human performance, right? They're on a level where they're trying to push for something that's literally never been done before, right? Like Austin, we're going for 900. Also, Matt Gary and Eric Helms, if you're listening to this, I heard what you said about him not hitting that on King of the Lifts. He's going to hit it. It's going to happen. Anyway, sorry, I took that a little personally.
Oh, dude, this is going to make a great little clip.
Oh yeah, I took that personally. Yeah, clip this.
I will.
Just like Perk said at Worlds. Somebody clip this. It will happen. No, I love Eric and Matt. They're great, but yeah, it will happen. Yeah, we're trying to push the bounds of what a human has ever done before. There's never been anyone in the history of the world that's done this. So you're going to have to, in my opinion, those types of lifters are always going to have to do things that are completely different than everybody else. And you have to be able to think about that. Sure, you might be able to take some similar approaches when you start, but you've got to think completely unconventionally. And that is ultimately what puts these lifters in a position where they become so much better than everybody else. Like, if you need the perfect example, look at Agatha. No one in their right mind would be like, and by the way, she's up to 8 SBDs now.
Yeah.
Nobody in their right mind would be like, let's do that. But you gotta be a little nuts, right? You gotta be a little nuts to actually push the bounds of performance. So yeah, that would probably be my take on that.
Yeah, Thomas Lilly says that exact same thing. He mentioned that on the podcast too. Kind of like, sure, maybe if you get another guy and he's going up against Gustav might get to a 315 bench easier if he has better genetics, sure. But the person without that good of genetics probably isn't altering their whole life to revolve around powerlifting. They're probably not trying to go from that 95, 96 all the way up to 99, 100% of their genetics. So the training, the lifestyle just has to get so dialed in, and it ends up being harder. I mean, not to get to the 315 bench, but they end up working harder, obviously, to eke out that last drop of their genetics.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, I think, yeah, you got to do some really odd things to make it work. And I don't know. I think that's the most fun part of this job. And it's why I do, I love working with anybody that I get along with, but it is so fun to get to work with these lifters that are the top of the sport, because you got to be creative. And, ultimately, I think that's the most fun thing that we get to do as coaches, is we get to be a little creative. It's still scientific, but we get to be like, there's an art to this that you don't always get to experience if you don't have somebody who's literally trying to push the bounds of human performance,
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, no one's ever totaled 900 at 74, so you are going to be the guy to come to. The only person you can ask, how did you total 900 at 74? You're like the N=1 example once it happens. You'll be the guy on the topic. So it is really cool. But dude, I think that was a great podcast. Do you want to tell people where they can find you for Instagram, anything? Yeah.
So I have my camera somewhere here. I've been filming social media content since I got back. I do have a recap of Austin's performance on IPF Worlds that's going up on Monday on my YouTube channel. So I think it's just Joseph Ross Stanek is the or it might just be, no, it's /Joe Stanek on YouTube. So that's going up on Monday morning around 10 Eastern. And I'm going to do one for each of my lifters that were on the podium for Worlds. So I'll be trying to do a little bit more long form stuff, just kind of going over that. We're in this case, it's just going to be like going over the performance, because I think we talked enough about the programming. But I'm going to try to post more on YouTube specifically. So that's what I'm going to plug there. You can find me on Instagram at OneRepMethods. More content is coming there, but I'm focusing on YouTube for now.
All right. Love it. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks, Ben.